+2 or -2. The results are going to be out or almost out. Again, it's not a matter of winning or losing. You always win if you take it in the right spirit. Welcome once again to News Analysis. News Analysis, a weekly magazine on current affairs. To begin with the main points in a nutshell. Syria, US to impose sanctions on President Assad. Strauss-Kahn arrest, Maid scared but will testify. Stephen Lawrence pair face murder trial. Libya, 4 foreign journalists released. Afghanistan, 12 dead at protest over Nato raid. Indian aid program beset by corruption, World Bank. And now the news in detail. Syria, US to impose sanctions on President Assad. The US is to impose sanctions on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad for human rights abuses, sources have said. It would be for the first time Mr. Assad has been targeted personally by the international community for his government's crackdown on protesters. President Barack Obama last month imposed sanctions on Mr. Assad's brother Maher and his cousin, an intelligence chief.
President Assad has made to lift the emergency law, for example, to institute reforms, and obviously to cease the violence against his own people. I should note for those who don't know that we have had a fairly aggressive regime of sanctions in place, unilateral sanctions, since I believe 2003, and this would be in addition to that if we were to pursue that course of action. But we're certainly looking at different ways to make clear to the Syrian government how appalling we find this behavior to be, and to encourage them both, as we have by speaking out against it, but in other means, to stop the violence and to move toward.
Hillary Rodham Clinton said on Tuesday the US would take further steps against Syria. Meanwhile, Mr. Assad has said his security services made some mistakes in their handling of demonstrations, the Al Watan newspaper reported. He attributed the shortcomings to a lack of experience with such situations, which he would said normally be the police's responsibility. Mr. Assad also gave assurances that Syria had overcome the crisis and that events were coming to an end. The newspaper added. The admission came as the reporters received new reports of attacks on civilians in Tal Khalak near the border with Lebanon, which has been besieged for several days. Activists say at least 27 people have died. Worse tactics, the US officials said the sanctions punishing Mr. Assad and 6 other senior Syrian officials for human rights abuses would be unveiled on Wednesday, a day before President Obama delivers a major speech on the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. The sanctions would freeze any assets they have in the US jurisdiction and make it illegal for Americans to do business with them. The US and the European Union have already imposed sanctions on senior figures close to Mr. Assad, but to have so far stopped short of targeting him specifically. At a meeting with European Union's foreign policy chief on Tuesday, Secretary of State Mrs. Clinton announced the US would be taking additional steps in the days ahead to pressure the Syrian authorities to allow peaceful protests. Strauss-Kahn arrest, Maid scared but will testify. The Maid, who has accused International Monetary Fund (IMF) head Dominic Strauss-Kahn of sexual assault, is scared but will testify against him, her lawyer says. Jeffrey Shapiro says when the 32-year-old woman discovered Mr. Strauss-Kahn's identity, a day after the incident, she feared for herself and for her daughter. He said there was nothing consensual about what took place in that hotel room in New York on 14th May. Mr. Strauss-Kahn denies all the charges. The woman told New York police Mr. Strauss-Kahn tried to rape her and picked him at an identity parade. He is charged with criminal sexual act, attempted rape, sexual abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and forcible touching. Mr. Strauss-Kahn, 62, is currently on suicide watch at a New York infamous Rikers Island prison. He will be back in court on Friday. His wife, former French television interviewer Anne Sinclair, is thought to be visiting him on Wednesday. Meanwhile, U.S. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner has said Mr. Strauss-Kahn is not in a position to run the IMF and an interim replacement should be named. Man of great power, Mr. Shapiro told NBC television that his client was expected to testify before a grand jury later on Wednesday. He said she had only become aware of Mr. Strauss-Kahn's identity a day later when a friend called her to tell her, "Do you have any idea who this man is who did this to you?" Mr. Shapiro said that his client was scared and incredulous. When she found out his encounter was with a man of great power and wealth, she feared not only for herself but more importantly for her daughter. The woman had now been reunited with her 15-year-old daughter in a safe place, he added. Stephen Lawrence pair face murder trial. The two men are to stand trial for murder of Stephen Lawrence. Gary Dobson, 35, and David Norris, 34, are accused of killing the black teenager at a bus stop in Eltham, Southeast London, on 22nd April 1993. Nobody had been convicted of the crime, but a small team of Scotland Yard detectives had continued to investigate the 18-year-old's death. Mr. Dobson stood a trial in 1996 over the murder, which he denied, and he was acquitted. Forensic review on Wednesday, the Court of Appeal concluded that there was enough new and substantial evidence to allow Dobson's acquittal to be quashed.
This morning, which means that we can tell viewers that Gary Dobson and David Norris are expected to face a murder trial at the Old Bailey in November. As I said, this has followed a complicated legal process because one of those two men, Gary Dobson, did stand trial initially in 1996. He and two other men were charged and stood trial in a private prosecution.
The inquiry into the failure of the original police investigation to find and convict Mr. Lawrence's killers, which reported in 1999, became a key moment in the modern history of criminal justice in Britain. Concluding the force was institutionally racist, it made 70 recommendations and had an enormous impact on the race relations debate from criminal justice through to all public authorities. The latest judgment was set out by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, Mrs. Justice Rafferty, and Mr. Justice Holroyd. They said the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a young black man of great promise, targeted and killed by a group of white youths just because of the color of his skin, was indeed a calamitous crime. Mr. Dobson and Mr. Norris were arrested last September over the murder and are in custody. The allegations could not previously be reported for legal reasons. Their trial is due to take place in November at the Old Bailey, and their next court appearance is due for 1st July. Libya, 4 foreign journalists released. The Libyan government says it has freed 4 foreign journalists detained for illegally entering the country. Those freed were 2 Americans, James Foley and Claire Morgana Gillis, Spanish photographer Manu Bravo, and Briton named Nigel Chandler. The fate of a South African photographer is unclear. Government spokesman Musa Ibrahim said those freed could stay and report in the country, Reuters said. The Libyan government has been fighting an uprising since February. Suspended sentences. James Foley works for Global Post and Claire Morgana Gillis is a freelancer. They were detained with Manu Brabo on 4th April. There was some confusion over the name of the fourth person released. A British journalist called Nigel Taylor was reported missing in March. Ms. Gillis, who writes for The Atlantic and USA Today, told the Associated Press news agency the four were at Tripoli's Rixos Hotel and were fine. She said a judge had given them a suspended one-year sentence. Mr. Ibrahim said the four were welcome to stay, but they would be escorted to the Tunisian border if they wanted to leave. He said, "We know that there were our foreign special European army experts fighting with the rebels, so army do not know immediately that these people are journalists, that they were harmless. If anyone was mistreated, then we extend our apologies." The fate of South African photographer Anne Hammery, also held on 4th April, is still unclear.
4 foreign journalists are safe, are healthy. They have been released. They have been just fined for entering the country illegally. They are with us here at this very hotel. They talked briefly to the journalists, and we told them that they can stay and work legally in this country if they like that. Otherwise, we can help them leave to see their families. They chose to leave, and we are helping them tomorrow to go to the Tunisian border and go back home.
So they are free to go?
Absolutely.